Welcome everyone.
Oops.
I'm Isaac. I am looking forward to this talk. Um, Danny's done a lot of development work, a lot of really great work. Previously, he was at NASA and Kraken. I met him when I worked with him at Answer AI. We did a lot of pairing together on Fast HTML and other projects, and I just thought he was, among the most brilliant people I've worked with, and a good person, which is why I'm so excited to have him here. He's been co-creating a new project with his wife Audrey, and I've contributed some to that. And I think both of us have used some AI to make the process more efficient. I've written about it some. Danny's going to share some of the things he did, and so pretty excited for this, and I hope you all enjoy it. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end if we have time. If we don't, I'll send a follow-up email with the answers to anybody's questions. So feel free to do that. So I guess to get started, Danny, I guess, can you give some context as to what this project is that you are creating and kind of set the stage for what we're using AI to help us with?
Sure, I can do that. Although the best way to do that, the best way to do that is with a demo, rather than me give like a marketing pitch. Can you see my screen? Can you see the big AIR logo?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So AIR is a web framework that is built on top of FastAPI. And let's see if I can show you. Okay, so we have an empty. Excuse me, that came out of nowhere. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to first install FastAPI, and I am a big fan of FastAPI. I have been so for a long time. In fact, I was delighted when Django got Django Ninja, which is kind of like a port of FastAPI to Django. Okay, so I've
And
installed the. Go ahead.
sorry, one quick thing. For those of you that don't know, if you're not familiar with web development, FastAPI is a Python library for making JSON APIs. It's very popular.
Yes, extreme, very, very popular. It's said that a quarter of Python developers have used or are using FastAPI, and pretty much every LLM service like and Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT under the hood, that the serving of content to us, the LLM, is done via FastAPI. So it's huge in the data and AI worlds. But as you can see, oops, that actually, I'm not sure where that pip installed because I have no environment. So let's initialize the environment. Can you see the text where I'm
Yes,
typing?
we can.
UV init, is that big enough? Excellent.
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, so I've initialized my environment. I'm gonna activate it. Oh, UV env. Okay, so now I've initialized it, which gave me these files. I've created a virtual environment, and now I'm going to activate the environment. So now you can see I have some files, and in fact, I have my virtual environment, and I've activated it. So now let's properly install FastAPI, and I'm going to install the standard version because that comes with the CLI and the command line interface. So now I have FastAPI. So let's build a project, a FastAPI project. And so unfortunately the Zoom window is in my way, but I'll just move down here so I can see better. I'm going to blow this up. Okay, so I'm going to import FastAPI into this project. So normally when you do FastAPI, you type from FastAPI, import FastAPI, you initialize the app, and you're going to wonder why I'm showing you FastAPI, or I'm going to explain why I'm doing a FastAPI demo before I give you an AIR demo. And that's because what I'm doing is I'm creating an API. And it doesn't matter what the API is. This is reflective of, let's say, Isaac and I decide to do a startup together, and we have a product, and the product is an API that is Isaac and Danny's. Oops, have to have double quotes here. Isaac and Danny's awesome API. And if you notice, if you notice anything about FastAPI, this is a standard view. And this is basically, a super minimal FastAPI project. And if I want to run it, I can do FastAPI dev, and this will run it locally. Awesome, works. Okay, we're going to open up another window, and you can see right here, I have an awesome API. And in fact, because it is FastAPI, that means I even get an open API display into my code. And this is super easy, as you can see. Even if you're not familiar with FastAPI, if you have any experience in Python, you're probably thinking, wow, I get all this for this little code. If I change this to post, then it handles posts of items, and then you can even pass in variables like, I don't know, ID int, and then you can specify and actually do something with that. So FastAPI is super powerful, and again, it has become really an industry standard. And FastAPI is awesome. I love the framework. However, FastAPI, in terms of serving out HTML pages, is not great. The experience is a bit cumbersome. Honestly, Django and Flask both do it substantially better. And this has always been a pain point for me. And this is why, the initial reason why we started up AIR. And I'm going to show you how easy it is with AIR to turn this FastAPI project to give it web pages. And for some of you might say, well, why do I need web pages? Well, you might want a landing page with your API, or special API docs, or a billing system that's tied to API usage. And with that, you need to be able to demonstrate to your customers your API usage. And typically, once you get beyond something really simple in FastAPI, people start building a separate app, like they use React. And there's nothing wrong with React. I love React, but if I'm building a Python project, I want to stay in Python. And that is, oops, before I do that, because it's not going to be able to find AIR, I need to install AIR. See, it says no module named AIR. During the UV, add AIR. And it's just as simple as that. Okay, so now, if you notice, I changed the FastAPI now, call it, instead of app, it's called API. And then with AIR, I instantiate the app by just calling AIR.AIR. Pretty much everything you need in AIR is in the root namespace. And this is just to make it easier on humans and LLMs. And now let's create a homepage for our project. We'll just call this index. Oops, I don't need these. And then we're going to return a layout. And what this is going to do is it's going to provide us an attractive look and feel. If you notice, my IDE is like giving me lots of data, and that's because AIR is extremely well documented. It could be better. We're making it better, but that has been one of our design goals from the beginning. And I'm going to add a title. This is an HTML title tag, and I'm going to call this, we're going to
I was just about to
Isaac.
comment about like how everything you're about to type, you're getting this like great tab completion, you're getting documentation in there, you're getting like all the arguments. It looks really nice.
Thank you. Well, it's we've had some awesome contributions. And there we have a web page, and it's not bad. You can see the HTML is already optimized. There's no extraneous spaces. But let's add a little bit more to it. Let's link to let's put up some links to our API. So we'll use section, and then AIR dot I think it's aside, and then inside of that we'll have API docs, and then we'll link to air.aside our API link. Okay, and now if we go back here, you can see that it's already pretty. So we use AIR is using a micro framework, and it provides two default layouts. One of them is called MVP CSS, which is a really light and easy to use semantic CSS framework. So this is just sending out very vanilla or plain HTML, and then MVP CSS is making us look good. Okay, so we have these. Let's add some links. So error.a. This is like a. This is exactly corresponds to what is it? The a tag in HTML. It actually renders out to that, and we're going to link to the API itself. All right, let's see if we. Okay, we did it the first time. There's no mistakes. That's good. So let's click on this. Let's see what we get. Oh, it doesn't like us. Let's try the API link. Nope. Well, that's because when we separated out our FastAPI project into its own thing called API, and we replaced it with AIR as an app, because of this, the API is not running it. And to make it run, we have to mount it in the AIR app. And so to do that, we just use this app.mount feature. And then we can just stick in the API. And whoops, that was, oh, I think we need to restart. Okay. And so we are not finding it, so that's okay. You know this is a live demo when when things go wrong. Okay, let's see. It is giving us a 404. Okay, so we have app error.mount. Okay. Oh, because I called it the wrong thing. Human error. Okay, so now we have our API running. We're getting our JSON again, and all the pieces are linked together. And if we want to reverse it, if we want to have the API host the app, we can also do that. And I mean, if that's the path that you want to go. So, oh, and I need to because we.
I think this is really great because I've always had, like, whenever I create apps, I always have this issue with, like, I need a UI for people to be able to, like, navigate and use and do features, regardless of whether I'm making like a blog or I'm making, a commerce site or I'm making anything. I almost always want a UI for it so people can navigate around and find it and read about it. But I almost always personally want to be able to, like, automate things and use the functions and call the API myself. And so having it both together is really nice. And there's a lot of approaches to that, but often it would be like I would have like a library that I then, like, host a JSON API somewhere and then a separate HTML service, or like Danny mentioned, I would have like a JSON API with FastAPI, and then I would use like React. I would use like Mantine sometimes to make it, or would just have a separate, library, and then I'd have like scripts that I run. And so it always felt disconnected. So for me personally,
Right.
and this is great.
I mean, yeah, the thing is like I said, I like React. I like Next.js apps. But there's a lot of cognitive load when you're adding these extra disparate pieces, when you have a front-end application and a back-end application. And there's a time and a place for. I'm not saying these, that approach isn't necessary, but for most projects, I just don't see where it's necessary. And because especially it's not just cognitive load while you're doing development and fixing bugs or trying to either locally or in production, there's also deployment issues that you've added an extra piece to deploy. And if you have a substantial team and a requirement to have like, crazy reactivity, okay, then, you know, that's a use case for that kind of stuff. But I'd say for you know, the vast majority of projects in the world, that's just a lot of architecture that we don't need. It's like using enterprise architecture for like, you know, most things. It's like using the same techniques to build a skyscraper, but for like a small single family home or, apartment, small apartment complex. Um, that's the analogy I'll draw.
Yeah, so this is great. So yeah, so this is kind of I guess the backdrop, the context. We're talking a little bit about AI today, but that entire web development library, AIR or framework, whichever you want to call it, um, is something that was built, and it was built, pretty quickly. I don't think you've been
Hmm.
working on it for all that long.
No,
Um,
if you want to know the URL, I'm posting it here for the main site right now is airdocs.fastapicloud.dev. But Isaac is correct. We have built it quickly, and I guess that's part of why we're talking today. And it will cover some of the techniques we used.
yeah, and I know I've done some contributions and used AI. Maybe I'll talk about them a bit later. But I guess what are the things? I guess that's a good transition. Um, so I guess let's start with like what are some of the tools that you use? Like I know for me, I'm like people that know me, they know I pay like the $200 Claude Code plan. I've got like all the expensive tools. Um, and you don't. You use, simpler tools and you still are highly productive. So maybe what are like the tools that you use? What are the things that you found helpful?
Sure, I'm happy to provide that. So in terms of, so first some background. I'm a big believer that if the CEOs and executives put everything on their corporate card or never invest their own money, we as common citizens have the same right to do that. And so I do not like to pay for tools with my own money. And and if I'm consulting or doing something like that, then I consider that my own money. If an employer, on the other hand, is like, "Hey, here's a corporate card," or "Here's some tools," I'm happy to take advantage of it. So that's why our budget for AI tools is zero. Now, it's a little bit, I guess, in a way, it's kind of disingenuous that I've said the budget is entirely zero because that there are ways we get some free stuff. So, for example, because we are significant, and my wife and I are significant open source contributors, GitHub graciously gives us some level of Copilot, um, which is helpful. And then there's also, because our email goes through Gmail and getting off of that would be a lot of work, we get some Gemini credits. It's not much, but that is helpful. So that is the background as to why our budget is where it is because we're finicky about, again, investing in tools when the rich people don't have to. Um, so those are, but Copilot and Gemini are actually the two tools I use. I haven't really enjoyed using Claude in the past. I don't believe there's any free access. I mean, not anymore.
I'm not sure if they have a free tier or not. If it is, it would be
Okay, when
very
I go
limited.
there, they tell me, it tells me to give them a credit card. So if there is
Ah,
a free tier, maybe I don't have access to it. Um, so all right, so I can go over how I use each tool if that's helpful.
yeah, I'd love to hear how you use each tool and what you use it for. I mean, there's all kinds of things from like testing, type hinting, building new features, designing the architecture, like what kinds of, and I mean then there's all this stuff too. It's like when you use a tool and you build something, like how do you make sure it's good? Because you can't like vibe coding
Sure.
is fun, but you can't just completely vibe code everything.
No. Um, I mean, I have nothing against vibe coding. I don't do it, but I but otherwise, I think it's an awesome experience. All right, so let me explain how I use each tool. So I think through Copilot, Copilot's powered by ChatGPT under the hood, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. So with Copilot, I've tried to use it periodically through VS Code, um, but my experiences there are not that positive. And maybe it's just the prompts that I had. I asked too broad of questions. But when I try to use things directly in the IDE, I find it a very frustrating experience. And I don't like other things changing my code as I type. Or like Copilot has, will sit and think for a long time, and I want to be constantly typing and interacting. So that's why although I get free credits with Copilot, I don't use it that much. Actually, another tool that I use is ChatGPT, although maybe I get the credits through Copilot. I'm not really sure. Um, and the way in that I use ChatGPT is I use it as a replacement for Google search. The unfortunate truth is Google search for software engineers is nothing like what it used to be. And um, uh, either it gives you AI answers that I feel like are heavy with hallucinations, especially when it comes to code, or and then the little window means that it's hard to adjust the prompt, or there's adware that you have to like sift through before you even get to responses. And people have talked about, um, I'm gonna say a naughty word, but people have talked about the shitification of Google search, that it has been intentionally brought to this point. So because of that, when I'm trying to look up a concept or a term that I don't like, what I'll do is I will go to ChatGPT, I go to the web browser, I don't use a special tool, and I'll prepare my prompt there. And I will usually, with the prompt, I often paste in some extra things, saying be concise, use as few words as possible, link to references, because as we all know, LLMs can hallucinate, and I don't want to go down the wrong path with either a concept or. But sometimes I'll ask for, if I don't know the API for something, I say, can you provide an example of using this library? And so being able to like validate what it gives is so important, because otherwise you spend a lot of time debugging something that's mythical. I'm sure I'm gonna if anyone has tried to use AI, you know that often you paste stuff into where you're working, and there's methods and functions and classes that don't exist that AI has told us do exist. So, um, and sometimes when that happens, of course, I'll say, "Hey, that's wrong," and I'll get a right response. And other times it doubles down. But the important thing is, I find I get better results when I do ask for those references, and I do ask for it to be concise.
Yeah, and I think that basically like grounding of having it try to give references, I think is um, really one helpful thing. And I think asking for code examples is actually really helpful as well. Um, I think that's one thing that I tend to do quite a lot is if I say, give me an example, like a full minimal example, like an example of using this library and this function, I know pretty quickly if it hallucinated and made something up because the code just won't run. And I don't have to like
Yeah.
I don't have to like read and be like, oh, let me look this up. It's like I just run it and it's like, oh, that argument doesn't exist. Like, okay, great. I know. And so those are I think very both
Oh, another
Really
thing I like
helpful.
to do is often, I'll say, okay, write me a function. I always ask for functions, just because I don't want to have a complicated, as soon as you get into classes and methods, I think it adds a level of abstraction, and you can turn a function into a method or whatever quite easily. But one of the things always, I will often provide a sample function of, hey, follow this pattern. And what I find out works pretty well is I have an expected result and I provide the expected result. Um, uh, Sometimes I'll ask AI, hey, what's the normal response for X? I have very mixed results with that. So I usually find if I handcraft these, um, to create it, that does help. Um, but then again, I have to be that person in the loop to check that it actually produces results that match. Another thing I do to validate things is write a simple a test to validate this. And, assuming that I'm using PyTest, write a test. So that way it, has assert X equals Y.
Yeah, I think writing tests is a really interesting thing because I find that using AI, sometimes I have more tests because it's like I don't mind having 3 extra tests for different edge cases. It's like write a bunch of tests, and I'm like, oh, some of these are actually I wouldn't have thought of. Like, cool, I could test.
Yeah,
Having extra tests is always nice, and so those kind of like enumeration things where it's like you could sit and think of like, oh, what are all the possible types of the possible edge cases that someone might pass into this function. I find that AI is helpful for generating those kinds of like things, especially if you have one test. You're like, make this test, but for like all different kinds of stupid inputs that someone might
yeah.
pass.
Actually, I have found one place where AI sometimes is awesome in terms of writing tests, which is figuring out how to test something. Uh, because I'm trying to think of a case. Have you ever seen run into a situation where there's some functionality and you don't know how to test it? A good example in AIR is we're working on adding server sent events, better support. We have an initial version on it. If you love server sent events, it's about to change. So AIR is still enough when we're allowed to do that. So we're gonna have a breaking change. But we just got in yesterday, so it's not like a big deal. But one of the issues is I'm not sure how to test server sent events yet. And what I'd love to use AI for is saying, hey, how would I test a server sent event inside of PyTest using the HTTPX client? And I personally don't know. Trying to Google that one is really, really hard. I could spend, before AI with stuff like this, I might spend days trying to push that in. One of the beautiful things about LLMs is because it can infer from what we want to some degree. I've seen people have a bit more, and myself included, success in figuring out how to test hard things. Because once you get the initial like, oh, this is how you test, is a combination, the sequence of things you have to do, and then once you get that first test, then either you or I guess the LLM can write out tests for all the edge cases you can think of. Um, but yeah, that for us with AIR has been one of the best things about the LLM is it helping us figure out how to test things.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because a lot of times there's a lot of talk about, well, if you use AI, your code is going to be bad. And I don't believe that. I believe that if you write good code, you could write good code faster with AI. If you write bad code, you can write bad code faster with AI. You can do either. um, but uh, but testing is a good example of where like you can actually use AI to make your code better because you can have better tests and more thorough tests and more examples. One thing
Yeah,
that
you can certainly have more tests. The downside is if you are hitting a persistence layer, like let's say you're working with an RM, even if the RM is functioning in memory, like what's so easy and trivial to do with SQLite, there is a time issue in terms of the tests. And I've wondered if for like AIR, like to run all the tests takes less vastly less than a second. But when I was working at Kraken Tech, which provides software for retail utility companies around the world, the test took 45 minutes. And that's expensive when you have 600 developers working. Actually, I think they're up to 750 developers. That becomes a huge corporate expense. That's like, you know, how much a continuous integration vendor will charge you is like worth teams of software engineers. So that's the downside is at the big enterprise level, you can run into too many tests. But that's an edge case. That is for the 99% of the rest of us, that's having more tests is not a problem.
Yeah, I think you got to be working on a project for quite a while before your problem is you have too many tests. I think most projects, the problem is you don't have enough.
Yeah, fair enough. I yeah, I one thing I do have to say, and I haven't explained how I use Gemini yet, and we should probably explain to people how I'm using it. But um, so I have mixed feelings about AI accelerating development. There are times it does, like to figure out certain things, like how to test SSEs inside of, a PyTest sort of world. Uh, but I have found sometimes as a human, with search and replace over bulk files or multi-line edit, I am vastly uh, faster than AI to address something. And so, maybe it's because I'm not using like $200 worth of AI credits a month like you guys. But yeah, my multi-line editing skills are like, yeah. And that's using VS Code. That's not like some weird Vim trick.
No, yeah, I think it's I still use search and replace a lot personally. Yeah, I'd have the $200 Claude Code plan and I just use Opus all day, so I'm probably one of the reasons that they're now introducing limits on how much AI you can use on their team. I was like $200 for the most expensive model unlimited, like, oh, that's great. Um so that is coming to an end at some point. Well,
Mm.
I'm one of the 5% of users that will definitely be impacted by that.
Oh
um,
no.
that's okay. That's okay. That's fair. And so, but yeah, I think knowing how to use your tool, I mean, it doesn't replace knowing how to use your IDE to look at docs or learning how to do find and replace with regex very efficiently. Um, One of the things that I found AI really helpful for was a PR that I did for AIR actually, where I was adding a whole bunch of like type hinting, and it was
Hmm.
for all the different HTML tags. And some of it's very repetitive, where I could
Oh
say like,
yeah.
oh, the class and the ID, we need that on every single variable. So you could do something, more programmatic there. But a lot of them are like, what are the arguments for this particular HTML tag? And it's a lot of like, look at the HTML docs, look there. Um, and I found that going through it with AI and using that to do it sped me up like a lot, a ton. I still
Yeah,
went
I
through
remember.
and checked every single one manually, just because I wanted to make sure it was correct and accurate. And I found some things like, oh, well, it added an argument that was like deprecated in HTML before, for example, or it missed one unusual one. So I still went through and checked it, but having it, 90% of the way done was great.
Yeah, I remember when you did that because I remember going like, Isaac, I know this is a lot of work, and you're like, no, 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 I'm using AI to like add in all these type ins, and it absolutely does make a difference. Uh, One of the things though, and this is for anyone who's listening who wants to contribute to AIR, is so after Isaac did this, we've been slowly adding the long form documentation to each one of these tags. And I periodically I'll go through all my Gemini credits in a day trying to get AI to do that. And because I don't know if it's again, my usage of Gemini or not, but it seems to chug through those credits really fast when I'm doing that particular task. If anyone wants to contribute to that, you know, I'm happy to point to an issue that we have it in. And what I mean by that is when you're coding on it, or when you're using AIR and you pull up a tag and it gives you that lovely drop down of instructions, um, well, we have the type-ins in there. The way IDEs and LLMs work is they also will look at the doc strings if you have it, and we just want to um, and also the documentation reference, the formal documentation reference is powered by it. You see this with make docs for materials. So if you want to help us flesh that out, we could certainly use help with that. Also, with my workflow, I don't like to wait while Gemini or Claude are thinking. So I don't have patience for it. But if you want to, some people have like a Zen feeling about this. It's just not me. So yeah,
Yeah, I
we're
think
open
there's
to contributions.
workflows that work different. And I think one of the important things, and I kind of touched on this when I talked about this type hints PR. I put the link to the PR in the chat if you're interested. But one of the key things is that like whether you use AI or not, like you are ultimately responsible for the quality of whatever you put out.
Hmm.
You know, it's like you can't be like, well, you know, VS Code didn't tell me. It's like, no, I mean, you have to, and so you kind of have to look through everything there. I'm going to put another example of a contribution that I did with AI. This one I did a write up with. And this was a layouts page an example. And then there's a link to my Substack where I wrote about that experience. And you can see how it did for writing and all the diffs of what I had to change and things before it was like good enough that I was comfortable submitting it because
Yeah,
I don't
this
want to
one
give
caught
Danny
me
like
by
slop, you know.
this one caught me by surprise because normally I can detect AI written stuff. And Isaac managed to pull one over on me. However, he didn't pull it over on Audrey. She's better at spotting this kind of stuff, and she's like, yeah, when because I merged it, and she said, "You know, that was AI written by AI." It's like, no, it wasn't. That's that's kind of Isaac's style, and she said, "No, that's AI." So, but yeah,
Dang, I didn't
well done
trigger.
that you told me.
Yeah. Um, and I think it really just takes, I think it's I see AI for writing as a really good drafting tool, but you have to go through and do lots of, round of edits. And I find that most sentences change at least a word or something when I edit it to make it in something that I'm happy with. All right. So let's see. The document args and tags. Cool. There's an issue. And actually, yeah, AIR is a great library to start contributing to if you want to contribute. Of course, all open source contributions are, work, but it's a great way to learn. All right. So we talked about tests a lot. We talked about questions a bit. We showed that typing. You mentioned a little bit about hallucinations, worried about hallucinations. And I mentioned that I like to have it generate code because then I can just run it and know if it's there. But like when you have something and whether it created, I don't know, created a plan that you can follow or like, hey, you should try this or that, or whether it created code for you or it recommended an approach, whatever it is, or tests, like what do you do? What process do you go through to like validate that it's correct or change it to a point where you're happy like committing it?
Oh, that's a really good question. Actually, I'm going to add to it, which is so what's worse, so much worse than hallucination is when AI gives you something technically correct, but it's bad. Like it'll run, but it's bad to the point of being dangerous. And the example I'd like to throw out there is I knew someone who happily accepted something from Claude, and about a payment gateway integration. And when a customer would have any issue with their account, like they were late on a payment, or their maybe their card expired, and this happens to all of us, uh, or if they are using, like I know there's some mobile payment systems in Asia and Africa, so maybe their account was low, so they had to replenish it. What it would do is it would erase the user's customer account from the system database. And this is really bad. This is, if we're going to use Stripe terms, this is like getting rid of the Stripe customer ID. But this is what Claude was giving. Maybe I should mention Claude, but okay, it's out there. And they happily accepted and didn't think through the implications, because they would just kind of blindly accept stuff. And I was like, no, you need to accept a webhook and process it. There's quite a bit more to it. So just letting you know, it's not just hallucinations are frustrating, but they're often not dangerous, right? To you and your company and to your users. But it's that's really scary. So how do I validate that? Um, to me, the answer to that is, just because AI produces the code doesn't mean that, well, regardless of where the code comes from, you still need to understand it. There's an old programming term called cargo culting, or black box coding, where you absolutely trust the box that does a certain bit of functionality. And we what's funny is we do this already. Like when you install FastAPI or use the request library, or hopefully you're on the HTTPX instead of requests, you accept that, hey, this code just magically works and I don't need to look at the underlying source of it. So at some level, we do have to block stuff off. But for stuff for our business unit, where we are building out our business logic, it is really up to you as a software engineer to understand every line that's being added. And so when I review stuff, if it's doing something magical I don't understand, I start looking at, okay, I don't understand what this line of code does. And you can, the most common place I see this happening actually is not in anything fancy, but in list comprehensions and generator expressions, where you see like some long thing. And so often, and you might find places of this in AIR, you might say, oh, this could be better done as list comprehension. Well, we, in some cases within AIR, and I've certainly done other projects, it's like, oh, this is a really sophisticated list comprehension. Let's convert it to a for loop so we can understand it better. There's nothing wrong with simplifying things to the point that you feel like you're simplistic. And I think that's one of the key things that you know that we have to take away from it, especially if we're using AI to also write the task. Because if we don't understand it, then we're blindly trusting, you know, the algorithm. Um, does that make any sense? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And sometimes like list comprehension can be, really concise and I like it. But other times, I find like I go in to debug something and I'm like, how does this work? Let me, dive into the details. And then I convert a list comprehension to a for loop. And it's like, well, at that point, I shouldn't put it back into list comprehension. Like if I had to break it apart to debug, then that seems like a more natural state to me. So I completely agree that it's a matter
Yeah.
of taste.
Another thing that I found is really good is, I don't know if you do this, Isaac, where um, if the answer that AI gives to a problem, I mean, vibe coding, the whole point of vibe coding is you don't care what's happening under the hood. You're just doing it until it doesn't appear to break, right? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But often if the code seems too long, I'll say, can you break this up into functions? because then with each individual function, you can pare things down quite a bit. And at I remember at Answer, there's a strong focus on that. And for those of you who are interested in Kraken Tech, that's a theory that they had, which is, all business logic in the company, needs to be in simple testable functions, not set inside of classes or methods. Just because a function is generally easier to set up for testing than everything else. So yes, that is another thing I do. I'll be like, okay, I don't understand this. My brain isn't big enough, but I can understand small atomic pieces. Give me functions.
Yeah, and I find that helps not just me understand, but then I can break it into smaller functions, and then I can start to combine these other things we've talked about. Like, okay, this is big. Let me make it into small functions. I still don't understand it. Great. Well, AI can now take this small function and give me an example or create some tests, and
Mm,
then I can like start to understand. Like, okay, what does this what does this do? And now I have a test. Maybe the test makes sense, or maybe it doesn't. But at least I have an example of what AI thinks the function should be doing, and I can start to like understand a little bit. And so I think using it to try and learn and explore is helpful too. I mean, I guess the real answer is that like nicely refactored, clean code just makes everything easier. AI is no
yeah.
exception. So we
So
got.
I
Oh,
just
go
want to
ahead.
say, yeah, I see the question. Is this about how to get the LLM to understand third-party libraries?
Yeah, do you want me to like talk through my thoughts, or do you want to talk about them?
Why
I can
don't you
talk through.
talk through yours and I'll talk
Yeah,
through mine?
yeah. Okay, so
Why don't we state the question so there's
there's a
people
whole
not looking
bunch.
at the
So
chat?
I'll
I
kind of
like the
go.
one about how do you get the LLM to understand third-party libraries, because that one can be brutal.
Yeah,
And
so
actually, AIR is designed to account for that.
okay, yeah, let's talk about that. Like one of my questions I was going to ask you next was actually what can library creators do to make their tools more AI friendly? So that's a perfect segue anyway. Um,
Okay.
how do you even to understand third-party libraries? For me, there's a few things. I think people when they use AI almost never spend enough time actually like curating context for the AI. Now, if I was looking and I was like, I'm going to build an app with AIR and I'm going to spend 3 hours on this app, I'm going to deploy it, and then I'm never going to touch AIR again, it's not worth it for me to spend 2 hours creating context for AIR to make AI better. That's almost never the case, though. It's almost always like, hey, I'm going to use this web dev library, whether it's React or AIR or fast HTML or whatever. I'm going to use this and I'm going to build a product with it. And I'm going to be using it because I'm going to be using it full time for my job or for my company or a lot for like years. And at that point, it's like, yeah, spending 5 or 10 hours making really good AI context that helps you like over the course of years, that's great, you know? And so I think people think a lot that spending that time to like handcraft and really make really great context is a big time investment. And it is, if you think about, is how is it going to help me build this one landing page? If you think about it, like, how is it going to help me use this library that I'm going to be using for the next like 2 or 3 years? All of a sudden, it's like, yeah, I mean, that time is inconsequential. If it makes my AI 5% better, like, I think you should. And so that's one thing is like spend that time, look at the docs, um, and some of it is I'll send an email. I think I did a talk on this actually, and I talked about like repo mix and stuff like that came in there as well. Um, but the high level is like yeah, you can get like general things like let me just concatenate all the files in AIR together, and that's my LLM context. Like that's what repo mix basically does, and that's a
Okay.
start. It just automatically does that. It just concatenates a bunch of files together. Um, and things like that. And Git MCP is the MCP version of that. It just works on any library. And then it's like, cool, there's like LLMs text or individual MCPs. Those are like the next layer. But if you're going to be using a library for a long time, I would take this context and I would say, like, okay, cool. I've got the quick start guide for AIR. That would be a really great LLM context. But you know what would be better? it would be better if I took that quick start guide and I rewrote all the examples to use Daisy UI because my project uses Daisy UI, and I rewrote them to use with a Postgres database because I use Postgres. Now all of a sudden, this quick start guide, which needs to be general, like Danny can't write a quick start guide for every possible way that somebody will ever build a web app, but I can write a quick start guide based on his work fairly quickly that uses the exact stack and my exact preferences and my exact database and my exact structure and organization and exactly what I do authentication wise. And that's going to be great context for it. And so, yeah, spending a little bit of time in that is great. And I think it's an investment that I don't think very many people put into it, but I think it's really well worth it. So, yeah, what do you think, Danny?
So I'm going to touch on the quick start in AIR because it's not there yet. We've been building stuff and figuring out how to do things. So the AIR quick start is actually, let's go back in time a bit. Flask, which is I guess an older framework, and it's awesome. It was started as April Fool's joke back in 2010. I remember that. It has this amazing quick start, and when I started contributing to FastHTML, I was like, hey, let's do the Flask quick start, but for FastHTML. And I plan to do it there. And basically, the quick start is going to have 20 or so common things that you need to do, or that you'll probably need working with a web framework. And that's what the quick start is. And so we're just really getting it working on there. And so that can make good LLM fodder to like consume and start figuring out stuff. But now to get onto what other things that I have picked up that I believe will make AIR really good for LLMs. First of all is namespace. I personally am fantastic at memorizing deep namespaces. So for example, if we're talking about Django, I know where all the pieces are in Django.contrib.admin, and I can start listing those off, especially I'm doing in code, even if I turn off all of the code completion stuff. And I know this for templates, filters, tags, and I typically memorize these things really fast. But I observed early on in my career that not everyone is like this. And so one of the things I really respect about Flask, going back to Flask, is the namespace is shallow. If anyone here has done Flask, pretty much everything you'll ever have to do is you do from Flask import blah, and blah is whatever you're going to need. And with AIR, for the most part, we follow that pattern. SVGs are in their own namespace just because there's so many SVG tags. We don't want to have, otherwise there's going to be just a ton of stuff that most people aren't using. Sorry, SVG users. We just have to stick it in that namespace. But for everything else, the AIR namespace has pretty much whatever you need. So yeah, and I think a shallow namespace also, besides helping humans, helps LLMs. That it's just one less connector in the chain. And maybe LLMs can memorize all this stuff and has all kinds of neat ways of doing it, but I just have found shallower namespace things seem to work better, especially for something that isn't in the global registry for LLMs like Django and React and these other tools are already there. AIR is, no LLM really knows about it yet. The next thing I would say is type annotations. Make sure everything is as type annotated as possible. And on top of that, keep your type annotations simple. I don't have any evidence for this, but I think because Python type annotations are effectively suggestions rather than concrete stuff like you get in Rust or Go. They're if you get into fancy type annotations to cover those edge cases, especially in the libraries, I think it possibly can make things, since it makes things hard for humans, I'm going to guess maybe it's kind of a struggle for LLM. Certainly, it will make it hard for people to use the output of the LLM, which is part of it. Another thing is excellent inline doc strings. One of the things that we want to do with AIR, and we're just really starting on it, is making sure every doc string includes a working example of how a particular thing works. And that is in part to just help the documentation general as humans. So that way, how do I use the Ginger render? That reference should actually show its usage rather than just saying, here's the class. I know there's like conceptual documentation or prose docs and the why things work, but the classes themselves or inline doc string should explain how they work. And that's I think part of good documentation now in 2025. The challenge, of course, is that how do you make sure those doc strings match the actual functionality, because that can drift, and that's maybe LLMs will help us with that inline doc strings. But also the prose documentation is important. And with those docs, we have to be very careful about accepting content blindly generated from LLMs. I have seen projects where critical parts of the documentation, what I consider critical, are clearly written by LLMs, that as soon as you start reading it, you realize that it's not explaining terms that the user needs to know in order to do it. And I know a lot of times we as humans who do that, but if you are writing tutorial docs or explanatory docs, typically people say, hey, this is how X works. When we say this term, this is what it means. And when you see things just skip forward or things are in a funny order and it never gets fixed, that means that not only was the documentation produced by LLMs, but because most readers are struggling to understand it at any level, no one's willing to submit corrections because they feel, oh, some really smart library creator wrote this, and if I can't understand, I'm not smart enough to understand it. And in a lot of cases, in some cases that I've seen, I don't think that's the case. I think the library creator used AI to write something, and then now everybody accepts it as gospel, even if it is, 9 meaningless drivel. And finally, a big thing that library creators can do is provide MCP for their stuff. And that's something that Audrey is touting for AIR. We don't have it yet. We're trying to figure out how to serve out MCP stuff using FastAPI. There's FastMCP, which is a framework, but as far as we can tell, you can't host MCP from within AIR, although if it's a WSGI server or WSGI server, in theory we can, but we're just starting to explore it because it'd be nice to tie that to the AIR docs and provide maybe different levels and for how that works. And by levels, I mean, it'd be awesome if AIR could somehow pay bills. And so we have this vision of like, okay, we'll provide like different levels of MCP service. The deluxe stuff it'll be, you have to, be a sponsor us on GitHub. But we're not there yet. We're still figuring out how to make it work. Because unfortunately, FastMCP doesn't appear to be a FastAPI project, so we can't mate it quite as trivially.
Gotcha.
So those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think we are, let's see here. We are close to out of time here.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Well, by close to out of time, I mean, we got carried away because we were having such a good chat and
Yeah.
way over, but that's okay. Everyone, I'm sure, enjoyed it. So there's one other question that I'm just going to address really quickly. Have I heard of spec-driven development, where you kind of define the plan in detail and then have the AI act on that in architecture.md. Yes, I do use them. It kind of depends on your use case, developing like a web development library where, thousands of people are going to depend on the code is very different than I'm going to create a landing page so that people with a contact form so that people can reach out to me, which is very different than an e-commerce site, which is very different from saying I'm going to build a feature that adds a hover effect to this thing, So there's lots of ways of coding with AI and the different tasks, fits in different ways. But I'll work on a blog post on that. So if you're
Awesome.
interested, follow my Substack and you'll get that. And I'll answer these questions as well in a follow-up email. Any last things you wanna cover, Danny, or
Well, yeah, I mean, said about spec-driven development. If you look at the traditional software development life cycle, or SDLC, traditionally we write up a spec, and there's a multitude of formats, and you can get into various different levels of complexity and patterns. You get into um, uh, you know agile and what that has unfortunately become, and waterfall, and all these different things. Whenever I start a project, I will generally write up a list of features. In fact, with AIR, if you read in the AIR docs, if you go to the about, I think there's a link to the original design document that I started in very early 2024, and I shared with Sebastian Ramirez about AIR, because AIR has always been friends with FastAPI. So yeah, I think that's really neat. I think one of the neat features of AI is by having a spec, especially that checklist, and having AI track that for you. It's kind of like the secretary of the team that Fred Brooks Meyer, I forget, the guy who wrote Mythical Man Month, talks about how you have a team of people, and a team of software engineers is supported by basically a secretary. And I don't, and secretary in the sort of, yeah, I mean, it's an administrator, someone who tracks a to-do list. And I guess you could call it a project manager, but I think it's kind of nice because it does have that list, and then you can assign some of the drudgery to AI. And so I think that whole spec-driven thing. In fact, the whole point of vibe coding is it looks at that list and then does it for you, and you're like, okay, it seems to work. Let's go. And I've touched, just so everyone knows, I've touched on vibe coding, and I don't try not to say anything negative about it because I don't want to be gatekeeping. And there are always going to be those people of vibe code who just accept things blindly, and then there are those who will come to a deeper software engineering understanding having started with vibe coding. And so that's why I never say anything negative about it. Although I've had negative experience running into people who willfully just took it blindly. And
yeah. I think the thing to think about, keep in mind with vibe coding is that, there's a level of like, what is your project designed to do? For example, if I have a very simple HTML page and I just want to make it look pretty, and it writes 2,000 lines of CSS and it looks pretty, sometimes I'm like, I don't really care. It looks good. I make it small. It's mobile. Like I don't care. I don't want to look through that CSS,
no, fair enough. Yeah, we're all like
And
that.
then there's other projects, like if you're building something for like diagnosing patients, medical software, that kind of like, I don't care what it does is super
You
unethical,
can't have that.
criminal,
Yeah, it's
And
criminally unethical. Yeah.
there's an entire spectrum in there. And And there's everything from, and so there's that spectrum, like what is appropriate. And then there's the spectrum of like, um, should there's vibe coding where like I don't care what the code is, but you can also do things like I'm gonna vibe code this feature, see what AI does, make some notes, revert it, and then like, okay, let me write it right. And I think that's great.
Hmm.
There's, you can, it's almost like, like in design, sometimes you like do wireframing. I think it's great to do like vibe coding as like a way of brainstorming and
Oh,
trying an
that's a
idea,
good
you know.
analogy. Vibe coding as a wireframing technique. Because
Um,
I'll admit, I do that sometimes. Um, awesome.
so
Oh, I
yeah, I
do
guess
have
I could,
something else to mention. Um,
yeah.
so Isaac and Eleanor are giving this class, and I'm sure you're going to link to it somewhere, about using AI to code better. And Isaac is, um, he's the guy who got LLM generated stuff past me, not past Audrey. And um, and Eleanor, is just amazing. And so if you really want to have a deep dive into this and learn tons of neat tricks on how to leverage AI to go really fast, because people talk about how now there's some studies that say that people using AI are actually going slower, that they're 19% slower. And I think that is through bad use of tools or reliance on tools in ways that shouldn't be done. If you want to um, use AI to the best of your ability, like this is the place to be. Um, or this course is where you should be going.
Yeah, and I think the productivity loss comes down to two main things. One, it's if you don't have the right approach, then you get really inconsistent results, and the inconsistency slows you down because then on every task you're like, oh, maybe I should try and use AI for it. And if it's not the right task and you get inconsistent results, then you go down bad rabbit holes, and you get this experience sometimes where you're like, wow, it was magical with this thing, and then it was a nightmare and I couldn't get it to help with this other task. And maybe that's because it's a new library, or like I've used AIR, I've used created lots of stuff with AIR using AI, and it's so new, it's not any of the model training data, so like
Hmm.
that's not, in my opinion, that's not an excuse to not be able to use AI. But it requires it requires a certain way of working. And so I think that idea of like, well, what is good? What is AI good for? And what should I do myself? What should I even tackle with AI is one problem. If you use the wrong things, you can go down, endless, you can go down a rabbit hole pretty far before you realize that that was a waste of time and you need to revert everything, or not making any progress and just inconsistent results. Because if you get inconsistent results, then you have no way of knowing, like, you have no way of ever building intuition over like this is a good thing to use AI for and this is not, because everything feels random.
Hmm.
Um, and if everything feels random, like how are you going to get better? It's like you're just shooting in the dark. So that's my opinion on it, at least. So yeah, I'll send out an email. I'll link to the Substack where you can get free stuff. Um, I'll link to the course. Because you signed up for this talk, you will get a discount to the course. So that link will be in that email as well. So if you're interested, join that. Um, and Yeah, I hope to see you around. There's a whole bunch more talks. So yeah, give me a follow. Definitely follow Danny.
You're interviewing Will McGugan, who's the creator of Textual and Rich. When is that happening?
That is happening. Let's see here. Let me just share my screen quickly
So
here.
if you ever look at the CLI for Fast API, and it's beautiful, that is because of Will McGugan. Uh,
I
just
think
he
everyone can
wrote
see
some of the
my
underlying libraries. We can
see
see
my
your
screen.
screen.
So yeah, so this is the talk, Universal UI for agentic coding in the terminal. So he built this because he can build better terminal interfaces than Claude Code and Gemini. So if you want an even better
Yeah,
one, check that out. He really can.
and it'll be able to use Claude and Gemini and other things, correct? Is my
Yeah, I believe
understanding, because
so.
it's a universal UI. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
it's gonna be awesome.
So that one's I'm super excited for that. And there's stuff like all over the spectrum, like this build of a product video in a day. That's the next one, which is, in a couple of days. This is actually full AI. Someone built an entire product hero a video using like Remotion, all with AI. And it's for an actual commercial product, and they're actually like using it for marketing. So it's not like a toy demo. Like they actually were happy enough to use it. And there's all kinds of other stuff, broadcasting graphics. This is like the chief architect of Open Hands. So if you're interested in how agents work, this is like an open source. It's like Devon, but open source, which means that you can like
Hmm.
look at the source codes and learn. So that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, this one's about running agents in parallel. I'm interested in that. As someone who built a almost like an IDE for that. This is with the CEO of SourceGraph on like AMP code, which is getting a lot of buzz. There's like a lot of stuff here. I'm super excited about this. I mean, I guess I could talk all day about this. I'm super excited about all of
Yeah.
them. You should join them all.
Join them all. So, okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, Isaac. I really appreciate it. It was good. Good chatting with you again.
All right. Yeah, so that was great. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.